What's up YouTube, I'm Guy, and today on the channel we are going to be checking out a Seiko, but not just any Seiko. Today we're looking at the Seiko Monster, reference number SZSC005. This is the third generation Jade Monster, and I am very pleased and lucky to have it here today. First things first, big thank you to the viewer that sent this watch in on loan so that I could review it. I have been wanting to review a Seiko Monster for, I don't know, years, honestly. I just haven't had the opportunity. One hasn't come across and been available for me to review. So yeah, a very big thank you to the viewer that sent this in on loan. I appreciate it very much. Now, as I had mentioned, this is a third generation Seiko Monster, and if you're not terribly familiar with the Seiko Monster, it's a watch that has been available in one form or another for quite a while in the Seiko catalog. They're constantly adding and changing and discontinuing models. They are something of a collector's item, a little bit of a Pokemon gotta get them all type of mentality for some of you guys out there. And I get it, they're kind of cool, and the variety and all of the different models available does appeal to that collector mentality in me as well. Now originally there was the first gen Seiko Monster, and I'll bring up a picture here showing the three generations side by side, but yeah, there's the first gen, then eventually came a second generation, finally like the one that we have here today, is a third generation. Overall, they mainly differ in the style of the dial. In that first gen watch, it has very squared off indices or markers, and inside of the markers you see that there's a minute track, numerals or indices, 5, 10, 15, 20, so on and so forth, all the way around the dial. On the second gen, that's where we start to really see that aggressive teeth or claw style indices or markers, the style of dial that really made you think monster when you saw one of these Seiko Monsters. Finally, there's the third gen, like the one we have here today. That dial is very similar to the first gen, but the shape of the markers on the dial are not quite as squared, and you don't have those numerals or Arabics surrounding the inner ring of the dial. Overall, which one do I like best? If I was going to own one of these, it would probably be the orange second gen. It's a really cool watch, and it's funny because I don't prefer orange at all. I don't really like the color orange, but something about that watch specifically really does appeal. Well, we're going to jump over to the tabletop. We are going to take a look at this third generation Jade Monster up close. I'm going to give you guys my thoughts and opinions on that, and then we'll come back over here to close this out with my final conclusions. Alright guys, here we have it, the Seiko SZSC005, the Jade Monster, a watch that I have been wanting to review for quite a while now. I have checked out a whole host of different Seiko dive watches in the past, and this is one that just hasn't come across my review table yet, so I am really pleased to have it here today. This watch is, I don't know, sort of an enigma for me. There's things about it that I really like, and there are things about it that I dislike. Would I ever want to own this watch? Up front, honestly, no, probably not. I don't think it's for me. But there is a lot of things going on with it that I can appreciate, that I do look upon favorably. So, you know, for the Seiko Monster collectors out there, the fanatics, I know where you guys are coming from. It's just a little too out there for me. It's a little too funky. The bezel, it's a bit much. There's some things with the case design that, I don't love. But again, other aspects about this watch that I think are fantastic. One of the first things about this watch that I don't love is the price point. We'll talk about price and value more in my closing or final thoughts, but suffice to say, I think this is very much an overpriced watch. If you can find them right now, they're in the $600 to $650 price range based on my quick look around the internet. The hang tag that came with this watch has a price of 60,000 yen, which converts into roughly 530 US dollars. Even at about 500 US dollars, I think it's a little bit high, I have to be honest with you. It's something that I've spoke about in the past when it comes to Seiko watches. They have been discontinuing great fan favorite watches over the last couple of years, replacing them with new watches and jacking the prices up, unjustly in my opinion. Now some people might say, well, Seikos were extremely undervalued and now we are paying what they should have been going for all along. You know, there's an argument to be had there, but it doesn't make me any less disappointed that we used to be able to find really nice Seiko watches in the $200 and $300 price range, and a lot of those are drying up, and watches like this are becoming available that are very, very similar in terms of quality, but $500 and $600. Let's talk basic specs and features on this watch. 42.5 millimeters in diameter across the round of the case with a 20 millimeter lug width. I'm really happy with that 20 millimeter lug width. Far too often do we get a 22 millimeter lug width on Seiko divers. The bracelet on this one does flare out at the lugs a bit, and I'll hone in on that closer in a little bit. So it does feel at the bracelet, at the lugs, a little wider than the 20 millimeters might suggest. However, it is, in my opinion, an improvement over 22 millimeter. As a overall thickness on this watch, 13 roughly millimeters thick, which is typical for all dive watches, be it Seiko or any other brand, no problem with that. The overall lug-to-lug width from one tip of the case to the other, from one end to end, or the watch's wingspan, as I typically call it, I get 47 millimeters on my caliper, but it feels a little bit smaller. You can see the lugs, the profile of the lugs, downward sloping and somewhat short and stubby. It doesn't really feel like an overly long watch from edge to edge. Overall, the proportions, the size and scale of this watch, pretty nicely done. On my 6 3/4 inch wrist, it's comfortable, it's definitely wearable, and I find that with most Seiko dive watches, despite their overall dimensions, the proportions make it tend to wear favorably on my somewhat small wrist. Aside from those measurements, what else do we have here? Well, we have a 200 meter water resist, ISO certified dive watch with a screw down crown. The crown is not signed with any sort of Seiko emblem or signature there. May or may not be a problem for some people. Frankly, I don't mind whether a crown is signed or not, but some people do. We have a 120 click unidirectional bezel, and as is clearly evident, a stainless steel bracelet with a okay but not great clasp. We'll come and talk about this clasp in a little bit. The dial on this, being as it is known as the Jade Monster, has this really nice radiant sunburst green or jade colored dial. We do, of course, have the Monster style handset, and the indices, which are applied on the dial and the handset, are generously filled with Seiko's legendary LumiBrite glow-in-the-dark luminescence. The movement in this watch is the 6R15. That is a 23-joule, hand-winding and hacking-capable automatic movement with a 50-hour power reserve and a suggested accuracy range from the factory of -15 to +25 seconds per day. The movement runs at 3 Hz or 21,600 vibrations per hour, so you don't get that super smooth sweep of the seconds hand like you would on, for example, a Swiss ETA movement running at 28,800. Personally, not a problem for me. I think that the people that are obsessed with getting that 28,800 vibration per hour sweep of the seconds hand, I mean, if that's what they like, that's their prerogative, but yeah, I don't know. It's overstated. It's not a big deal one way or the other for me. What is a big deal is that in my experience, historically speaking, dealing with dozens upon dozens of Seiko watches over the last several years, their movements are not what they're cracked up to be. Now, I don't have as much experience with the 6R15 movement, but I have done plenty of research on all of these movements being the 7S26 and its brother and sister movements, the 4R3536, and of course the 6R series of movements. In the research that I've done, and based on my own anecdotal evidence, they are not reliable, good timekeepers. Very, very often, you'll get one of these movements and it will be keeping excellent time, but for no discernible reason, it will begin to run very, very fast, or very, very slow, or very, very erratically. Not because of magnetism. That's one of the first things that people will say is, oh, it's probably magnetized, just go demagnetize the movement. In my experience, it's almost never magnetism that's the problem. I don't know what the problem is. There is tons and tons of discussions on forums talking about this exact issue across all of the more affordable Seiko movements, and in general, I have become a little bit sour on them. When they do work, yeah, they work fine. They're generally so-so when it comes to accuracy. I have some Seiko watches that have been plus 5 seconds per day, minus 5 seconds per day in that ballpark, but I've had others that I've regulated to be very, very accurate, only to find some months later that they're suddenly plus 50 seconds per day, plus 60 seconds per day, or worse, when I put them on the time grapher, they'll run very, very, very fast, maybe plus 60 seconds per day for a minute, and then they'll slow down and run suddenly plus 20 seconds per day for 30 seconds, and then swing wildly to some other rate with, no discernible explanation. Again, I have kind of become negative on these movements. So, while this does have the quote-unquote upgraded or highest grade of the more affordable Seiko movements, the 6R15, in general, I'm just not impressed with these movements, and I think that there's a lot of people out there that are seeing the same results as me and starting to feel the same way. So the first thing I want to talk about with this Seiko Monster is the case. And when you see this online, if you've never seen one in person, you see it from this kind of top-down perspective, and you don't really grasp how strange and quirky the case design is. None of this might be a good thing, it might be a bad thing, it depends on your perspective. But when I got it in hand and really started looking at it, I was surprised at the overall shape and the geometry, the style of the case. It's very interesting. Once we start looking at it three-dimensionally in profile, we start to see a lot of things. As I had already noted, of course, we have pretty short, stubby, very downward sloping lugs that terminate at a flat on either sides and a little bit on the bottom as well. Also, these are perforated or drilled lugs, so that's a plus. On the sides of the case, we have these little scooped out areas, and they're polished in there. Otherwise, everything is of a very coarse grain, matte, brushed finish. Those little scoops line up with the edge of the bezel when the bezel is in the 12 o'clock position. Not perfectly, though. I don't know how well it's going to show on camera here, but the alignment of the edges from the bezel into these scooped out portions of the case, it's not a perfect seamless alignment. Now, this isn't exactly a high-end luxury watch, but for a Seiko dive watch, we're approaching and exceeding $500 and $600. I'd like to see this refined and just, lined up a little bit better. That would be nice. The next thing that's interesting is if we look at the case from this angle here, we have the lugs. And the lugs kind of ride up and cover a good portion of the bezel on the south side as well as on the north side. Interestingly, those lugs come and curve around to create the crown guards on the lower side of the crown, and then on the top side, a piece of metal just comes and protrudes off of the case. It's interesting, it's sort of, it's not a tuna style case, but it's sort of like a tuna style case in that shrouded kind of surrounding on the case. Not exactly, not 100%, but sort of. It's interesting, and you don't really see that in the pictures when you're just checking these watches out online. That was something that I was not expecting to see. Now, on the top side, the lugs are just trimmed off on either side, but they do again come up and then surround a good portion of the bezel, both on the top and the bottom. What that means is you're basically not going to be able to manipulate the bezel very much from these positions. You have to go at the northeast and the southwest sides to manipulate the bezel. It does mean that you can't rotate it a great distance with one spin. You do these little short spins. Not the best in terms of overall use and functionality. I would prefer it if I wasn't impeded in my usage of the bezel so much by the lugs and how they come up here. But I guess that's just, the Monster case shape or design, and, it is what it is. You have to live with it. But it's another small thing about this watch, or one of the small things about this watch that I think is more about style than design. It's built more for form than function. The bezel itself is interesting. It's kind of funky, kind of ugly, honestly. It depends on your perspective, I suppose. But we do have these big, scalloped out, very aggressive edges, the knurling or texturing, whatever you'd like to call that. And then, scooped out divots all around. You can get very good traction or grip on the bezel to manipulate it, but it's just very big, very chunky. It feels kind of, I don't know, aggressive maybe, and I suppose that maybe is fitting for the quote-unquote monster watch. I don't love the style or the aesthetic. It's just a solid chunk of stainless steel with engraved graduations that are filled with probably some sort of paint. Functionally, it does work. It is fully graduated. If you wanted to actually use the bezel, you can put it into position, and obviously it's very legible and readable, very, very usable. Aesthetically, it's not my favorite. In terms of the action of the bezel, it's typical Seiko. I always describe Seiko's bezels in these more affordable dive watch ranges as being kind of mushy or spongy. This is very much just like that. I think it's good. It's not too tight, it's not too loose. It's just a little bit spongy. That's the way I always describe these. If you've ever spun a Seiko bezel, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's pretty much par for the course. I did mention we have an unsigned screw-down crown. The texturing on the edge of the crown is very nice. Operating the crown is very easy. Wind it backwards to unscrew it. Get into that hand wind position. You can hand wind the movement. Pulling the crown out to the first position lets you quick set the date. Second position hacks, and you can, of course, set the time, as you would expect. Pushing the crown back in, and with a little downward pressure, wind it forwards, and you will screw it back down to the case. This particular example is very well done. Now, what I would suspect probably happens from more often than you would prefer, because it has happened to me on other Seiko watches in general, is the threading on the screw-down portion of the crown going to be nice and smooth. Generally speaking, it's hit and miss in my experience with Seiko watches in general. This particular example is quite good. Screwing and unscrewing the crown is nice. The threading is very clean. But I have had plenty of Seiko watches that they feel very gritty, very tight, very difficult to manipulate that crown to unscrew it. Quality control at Seiko on these more entry-level and affordable watches, again, can be very hit or miss. In this particular instance, it was very much a hit. We'll come in a little bit closer here. You may not have noticed we have a Cyclops Magnifier on our Hardlex crystal. Since this is a date-only version of the Monster, as we had seen earlier, previous generations were day and date versions. To be a date-only version, it does kind of make sense to have a Cyclops Magnifier. Now, a lot of people dislike the idea of having this little bump of glass on the Cyclops. They think that it's aesthetically not pleasing. I like it. I like being able to read my date. It makes the date more legible. It works very good. It's very clear. There's not a ton of glare. Overall, the Cyclops is implemented very nicely. It's one of the things that I really like about this watch. The crystal in general, maybe a slight dome to the crystal. It is, of course, Hardlex, Seiko's proprietary crystal material. Very clear, very crisp, very, very legible. Not a ton of glare. I think, yeah, the crystal and the Cyclops are done very, very well. Moving on from the crystal, we have our dial. This is, of course, a third generation Seiko Monster, and as such, it has the dial for that generation of watch. Of all of the Seiko Monster dials, in terms of the design or the layout, it's probably my least favorite. I like the Gen 1 and the Gen 2s better. The Gen 1 is very similar to this. The Gen 2 is very different. The Gen 2 has the very aggressive, jagged, teeth-like markers. The Gen 1 has square markers, whereas these have a slight angle, a trapezoidal shape to all of the markers, aside from the 12. On the Gen 1, it's perfect squares. The thing that really differs is that on the Gen 1, inboard of those markers, you have numerals 5, 10, 15, 20, and so on and so forth around the entirety of the dial. I really like that, and I wish they would have done that on this dial. That notwithstanding, the dial is very, very nice. Now, all of these markers are nice applied markers with metallic surrounds or borders. It's done very, very well. Outboard of those markers is a nice sloped chapter ring, which is sort of etched or scooped out to allow each of those markers to inset into it. It is all nicely done. That chapter ring is graduated, of course, for each minute or second. The rest of the dial, it is that sunburst, green, jade, gradient style of dial. Probably not doing it any justice here on my camera, but believe me, in person, particularly out in the sunlight, it does look beautiful. No applied logo, just printed with the Prospex Automatic Divers 200 down at the bottom. Very nicely done nevertheless, I don't have a problem with that. The Seiko Monster handset, this style of handset, basically the same amongst all generations of monsters, has that very broad, arrowed hour hand with, I don't know, what would you call that minutes hand? Sort of like a dagger or something. And then another arrow style seconds hand. Everything on this dial is very amply filled with lume. I'll bring in a lume shot here. Of course, if you're familiar with Seiko's Lumibrite, this is nothing new to you, but the lume does look fantastic, as always, as expected. The date complication, notwithstanding that Cyclops Magnifier over it, is a black date disc or wheel with white text. So you can see we're showing the 9th. Again, very legible because of the Cyclops. Good contrast, white text is always very nice and easy to read for me. Overall, I like that as well. Everything with the dial and the hands is done very well, and it's one of the things that I like about all of the Monster watches. I think that the orange Generation 2 Seiko Monster with the very aggressive teeth-shaped indices or markers on the dial, that might be my favorite, and I don't like orange watches generally, but I'd love to have one of those. It's really nicely done. This also nicely done. It's excellent, and yeah, I love the dial, love the hands. Very, very nice. The last thing to really talk about here is the bracelet. I had mentioned that we have 20mm lugs, and I really appreciate that because I typically don't prefer 22mm lug width bracelets. I like 20mm bracelets, definitely don't like 18, prefer 20, like 22 a little bit less, but it's doable. This does flare out at the first link though, so the bracelet does feel a little bit bigger despite the lug width being thinner. I would suspect if you threw this on a leather strap or a NATO, it would wear very slim, and or at least slimmer than this bracelet does. Now, the overall construction of the bracelet, it's interesting in that you don't really have fitted end links. But it works. It's not a problem. Generally, I might complain that you don't have a nice fitted end link here, but yeah, I got no problems with the way that this bracelet integrates into the case. You have these bits of high polish here, 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 and so on, but it's not, you know, the best mirrored high polish. It's just barely noticeably more polished than the satin brushed finish of the rest of the links. The edges of the links are, of course, also polished. It is just actually I'm not 100% sure if this uses pins and collars or standard friction pins. I didn't look at it very closely, but it's not a screw-in linked bracelet. That's another small complaint I have. At this $500 to $600+ price point, this bracelet does come in a little short in a number of ways. The main way is going to be the clasp. The very cheap Seiko stamped metal clasp, fold over safety latch, dual button deployant triggers, but then this low quality swing arm, pressed metal blades, very disappointing. The clasp itself, just some micro adjust holes here, but also that low quality, unimpressive pressed or stamped metal. Yeah, overall, it's a real miss. We do have the diver's extension that is pretty common on Seikos. You unfold or unhinge this little gizmo here, and it will let the extension out. I have no fingernails right now. I'm not going to kill myself trying to demonstrate that. The long and short of it is it's unnecessary. Nobody is really diving with these watches. I don't know why they keep putting diver's extensions on any of these watches, be it a $200 or $500 or $600 Seiko, be it a $4,000 to $5,000 Seamaster. The idea of a diver's extension, I just don't get it. Again, I don't believe anyone is really using these watches as dive tools anymore. The other weird thing about this bracelet, so if you look at the bracelet here, you got quite a substantial amount of taper, then it trims out a little bit, then you have this last link, and it's just a very aggressive step down, and that's not a removable link. The link is integrated into the clasp, it looks like, but it's not a smooth transition. Again, just a harsh, abrupt step down between the last removable link and this little integrated link. I don't know what to say about that. It's a little off-putting in terms of, looking at it and scrutinizing the overall presentation, but functionally it's not a big deal. So yeah, I can overlook it, but as a watch reviewer, I feel like point out and acknowledge the fact that it's a little strange looking. Here it is on my 6 3/4 inch wrist. Fits and wears very nicely, as all Seiko dive watches do, generally speaking. There's a few bigger ones like the Sumo. That was a little larger than I prefer. Felt a little too big for my wrist, but this Monster, it wears good. I could see definitely having this as a daily wear watch. In terms of the overall fit and scope and scale, definitely not a problem. In terms of, the style and the aesthetic, again, lots of things that I love about it. Some things I really don't like about it. I don't think I could make this a daily wear watch for me personally, but I get why there are so many fans of the Monster watches in general, and yeah, it's a cool watch. Alright guys, there it is. There is my review of the Seiko Monster. So, what do I think about this watch? Well, it's not for me. I think you guys probably understand that already, but I think it is a good watch. There's a lot of things that I do like about it. The dial, very nicely done, very high quality. The applied markers, the handset, very nicely done. I think that the quality of the case is nice. The finishing is, about what you would expect for a watch at this tier. And yeah, for the most part, I think it's a good watch. Certified ISO diver, 200 meter water resist, all of the features that you would want out of a rugged, reliable, robust tool watch. But there's a lot of things about the style that I don't like. Aesthetically, it just doesn't work for me. I think that manipulating that bezel is a little too cumbersome because of the way that the case comes up and surrounds the top and bottom sides of the bezel, putting your fingers in a position to not really get a lot of real estate on that bezel. I think that the price is a little bit of a problem for me. At even $500 and some dollars, upwards of $600 and $650, I think it's just too expensive for what is effectively an entry-level Seiko dive watch. Just my 2 cents. I think that there's a lot better values to be had out there, even within the Seiko line. Alright guys, that's going to do it for today. I hope you enjoyed this review of the Seiko Monster. I really do appreciate, again, the viewer that loaned this to me, and I appreciate all you guys for taking the time to watch my review. If you'd like to help support the channel, down in the description of this video and every video that I do is a number of ways that you can help me out. Number 1, click on my Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram and follow me on those platforms. Number 2, if you'd like to help support me on Patreon, that would be a great help, and a big thanks to everyone that has been. Finally, if you like anything that I've reviewed and you're considering purchasing it, you can click on my Amazon affiliate link first, and when you buy that, or anything else for that matter, I get a small commission. Those commissions do add up, and I really do appreciate all you guys that have been using that Amazon affiliate link. Thanks again. Well, that's going to do it for today, so I'll end this by saying bye now.